And again, while I am generalising, from the early part of the 80s in New Zealand, a genuine attempt to try and think this through and reconsider those three commitments of what it meant to govern all New Zealanders equally, while still respecting the rights which were conferred and yet offering equality. To cut a very long story short, Mr. Chairman, we now have had a period of history that has sought to right some historic wrongs. We established a treaty of Waitangi Tribunal that allowed grievances to be brought. In other words, it sought to study history. And it made recommendations to the government as to how we might consider these matters in a new way. The recommendations were not binding on the government. It was up to whichever government was in power to consider whether to accept these recommendations and how then to negotiate with Maori to achieve settlement. This took many years of a process of establishing trust. But in the early parts of the 80s, there was a breakthrough where Maori, having had the tribunal sit and seek to understand their history and make recommendations, Maori realised that in order to move on, they needed to actively put the past behind them and try and engage in a process that would allow them to shape their future. Governments at the time also agreed that they should try and engage in this way as well. And again, to cut a very long story short, after negotiations that sometimes took 7 years, major treaty settlements have been achieved. These are legally binding settlements where Maori, in accepting the settlement, write away any further legal right of redress of historic matters. And in making these settlements, there was both land and finance settled on Maori. And what it has done is made Maori feel that they are stakeholders in New Zealand's economy, as well as people who have now been acknowledged and treated properly in terms of the intention of the original settlements at the time that the treaty was signed. It hasn't been a panacea for recovery, but what it has done is allowed New Zealanders to feel that they are included in the processes in a constructive way. It is also true that we've learnt a lot about each other in this process. Many New Zealanders who were uncomfortable with the issues of acknowledging history and difference have now realised that having reached settlement, people have become investors in each other's interests, and enormous leverage and improvement has come forward. What is more, we've now seen people who had not taken a great interest in human capital development also take new steps. Maori are now hungry to be educated well. And while in the late 70s you would not find Maori in the top echelons of New Zealand's professions, today you find young Maori people across every sector of New Zealand's professions, in the law, in medicine, in every aspect of commerce, and they are genuine stakeholders in this regard. The lesson from the Club of Madrid's point of view, if there is a lesson at all, is that in order to create a shared society that is genuine, it can't be one that is demanding in terms of equality or inclusion. You can't, by your insistence, say, because we share the same land, we are the same. Indeed, I would argue that, based on our own history, that is an extremely unintelligent approach to the ways in which to get genuine inclusion and cohesion and stakeholdership that allow us to move forward. In the case of the Club of Madrid, we wanted to go and see if we could find societies where some of these elements, while not the same, had learning for us that we could then offer to future leaders to consider as they go forward. And much of what we have done in the last 2 years is look at states like the state of Ireland that had an enormously complex religious conflict that held Ireland back for many, many years. And yet when leaders agreed that there was a time that had come where differences needed at least to be put in context, where they focused more on what they held in common rather than what divided them, it was then and only then that there was a way found for Ireland to move forward. It is interesting that it is both intellectual leadership but also leadership action that appear to be common features of these breakthroughs. In other words, the concepts themselves, while important to identify and analyse, they alone are not enough unless there is engagement at the political leadership level, at the social and community leadership level, at the NGO level, in some instances at the level of the church and other institutions that are important in these societies, until there's a genuine degree of engagement where people are willing to be part of what is often a difficult and uncomfortable conversation. It is both that action of leadership and intent that appear to be common features of these major breakthroughs occurring. So the issue of strategic leadership, as well as analysis, issues that the Club of Madrid has identified as being extremely important. And so to move on, we have identified within our project of work several areas that seem to be themes that have been reoccurring in societies that have made progress. And I want to share those briefly with you this afternoon. We call them our commitments. Really, they are elements of a toolbox that if you were to go through and even use some of them, you might be finding that you would make progress. They are each a speech in themselves, but if you will indulge me, I will try and summarize quickly. The first element appears to be that there has to be a commitment somewhere in your society to locate the responsibility for social cohesion. So whether it's a ministry or a minister or an institution or a number of institutions, to actually firstly agree that you're going to have some agents that are responsible for advancing cohesion, and then locate responsibilities into those institutions appears to be the first point that's critical. The second is the issue of consultation. Unless we indicate an open mind, we will have closed ears. And if we have people who are not engaging in the conversation, we can't expect to be successful. So creating genuine opportunities where minorities can be consulted and listened to, and their ideas and concerns acted on, is the second common and important theme where inclusion and cohesion appear to be outcomes. The third is where governments are prepared to impose on themselves and other organisations monitoring, some ways in which, if you've set goals, to then monitor whether or not any progress is being made at all. I'm sure all of us in this room would agree that it's very easy to sign a commitment. It's much harder to deliver on that and then to be prepared to be held to account not by others, but by your own. The Club of Madrid is not promoting or proposing that external parties should monitor whether or not cohesion is occurring. We want to encourage member states to see this as their own issue and to then try and put mechanisms in that will actually analyse and monitor whether or not they're meeting their own standards.